I've just been filming some sort of quick B-roll for my 10-year YouTube video, but I thought since I had the camera set up, I would just tell you all really quickly about some more lovely things in Emma, because I've been finishing up my reread. There's so many just wonderful phrases. Her skill with words is just so magnificent. The phrases I'm going to tell you are from somewhat later in the book, so I'll just go ahead and give a spoiler warning if you're concerned about that. But this is right after Mr. Elton proposes. And I love how Austen describes that Emma was occupied in most unmirthful reflections. Isn't that great? And then when they were at the party and Mr. Elton was being just annoyingly attentive, we hear that during the most overpowering period of Mr. Elton's nonsense. This is such a beautiful description of the friendship between Emma and Mrs. Weston, Miss Taylor, her governess. There was no creature in the world to whom she spoke with such unreserve, not anyone to whom she related with such conviction of being listened to and understood, of being always interested and also intelligible, the little affairs, arrangements, perplexities, and pleasures of her father and herself. She could tell nothing of Hartfield in which Mrs. Weston had not a lively concern, and half an hour's uninterrupted communication of all those little matters on which the daily happiness of private life depends was one of the first gratifications of each. That's just so lovely about, you know, just to chat with like a family member or a close friend who you can just tell anything to. And I love this part, that she's not only interesting, but also intelligible. Because that is so true. I feel like with some people, I mean, I guess that's kindred spirits, right? Some people, it's like, might be interested in what you have to say, but like they don't really get it. You know, it's not really intelligible to them. But with Emma and Mrs. Weston, like they get each other. They're operating on the same wavelength. This is another line that struck me. This was right after Mr. Elton proposes in the carriage. In this state of swelling resentment and mutually deep mortification, they had to continue together a few minutes longer, for the fears of Mr. Woodhouse had confined them to a foot pace, because they're still stuck in the carriage together. If there had not been so much anger, there would have been desperate awkwardness, but their straightforward emotions left no room for the little zigzags of embarrassment. Just that way of describing the situation so precisely and accurately and interestingly. Like, because yeah, that would have been desperately awkward. But since they both were pretty darn honest, it was just anger. Plain, honest anger. No room for the zigzags of embarrassment. I love that. It is a bitter pill for Emma to swallow that she got the Elton-Harriet situation so mixed up. It is those unmirthful reflections. But the thing I love about Emma, this is another scene where you really see her strength of character. And this is something that's common to all of Austen's heroines and heroes, like all of her best characters. They always look their mistakes in the face. When they see that they're wrong, they don't shy away from that knowledge. And I feel like that is so common in human nature, that like if you are confronted with the clear evidence that what you did or thought was wrong, but talk about zigzagging, they will like zigzag, dodge around, do anything to avoid the truth of admitting to their mistake. But Emma, she gets there. I mean, you see her like trying to excuse herself, but then in all honesty, she has to admit the first error and the worst lay at her door. It was foolish, it was wrong to take so active a part in bringing any two people together. It was venturing too far, assuming too much, making light of what ought to be serious, a trick of what ought to be simple. It takes some practice for her to truly take her hands off matchmaking, because it's obviously an old habit. But Emma always has that self-knowledge, even when it's not very flattering self-knowledge. It's so much fun when Frank Churchill arrives, and of course, I already gave the spoiler warning, the whole Frank Churchill, Jane Fairfax secret engagement. When you read it knowing about the engagement, it is so funny, like to see Emma and Frank's conversations. And Frank, I think, later says that he thought Emma knew. He thought Emma had guessed. And you could kind of see that. At one point, Frank mentions that he is the wretchedest being in the world at a civil falsehood, that like he wouldn't be able to just tell a lie in conversation. And Emma calls him out. "I do not believe any such thing," replied Emma. "I am persuaded that you can be as insincere as your neighbors when it is necessary." And it's just so ironic because he is being completely insincere to his neighbors at that moment, concealing the engagement between him and Jane Fairfax, concealing the fact that he's the one who gave this piano, that he's like speculating who gave it. Like, yeah, it's you. Anyway, I also have here The Cloud of Unknowing, which I have started and really have been enjoying this. I've also been doing the Consecration to the Blessed Virgin Mary, which I read about in that book by St. Louis de Montfort, which I read during Advent. And I found like a website that has like the prayers all listed that you're supposed to do each day. And that website also has excerpts from Imitation of Christ by Thomas A. Kempis. I'm thinking once I finish this, I'm going to try to get Imitation of Christ, but it's fun to have little excerpts of that and then also to be reading this. I haven't read the full introduction yet. I usually like to read, especially with classics, I usually like to read the book first and then go back and check out the introduction. But I did happen to catch this page and I thought it was really neat. So the author of The Cloud of Unknowing is unknown. We don't know his name, which, considering what he is advocating to kind of forget yourself in this cloud of unknowing, and that is how you ascend to know God. You really need to put aside your own personality, put aside your own will, put aside the things of this world. And obviously, he put his money where his mouth is because we don't know his name. When he wrote this and distributed it, he did not have his name attached to it, and now today we don't remember his name. And I feel like that is just in keeping with the work itself. But here's this from the introduction. He belongs to a century made famous in the annals of spirituality by the names of Richard Rolle, Juliana of Norwich, and Walter Hilton in England, by Meister Eckhart, John Tauler, and Henry Suso in Germany, by Jan van Ruysbroek in Flanders, by Jacopone da Todi and Catherine of Siena in Italy. This is an age associated with the names of Angela de Foligno and Thomas A. Kempis, so the author of Imitation of Christ. It is an age when, in spite of troubles and rumbling presages of a coming storm, Europe was deeply religious. Faith penetrated to the very hearts of the people and influenced not only their art, music, and literature, but every aspect of their lives. I am familiar with quite a few of the names in that list, but not all of them. So I feel like this is an additional TBR that I need to get to at some point. Try to find a spot to sit down where I could get my plants in the background, or at least the green plants that I have at the moment. I'm about to start my seedlings, which I'll have to keep them indoors for quite a while longer, but I'm so eager for spring. My tulips and hyacinth have just started to appear outside. I've already covered them with netting because I know the deer would eat them. I have been enjoying some middle grade March breeds. I started with the borrowers. I feel like I've been hearing so many people talk about it, and I really enjoyed it. I love doll houses and like tiny things, and this is so evocative. It really shrinks you down and takes you into the world of the borrowers. They're basically like the little people of legend who, you know, you hear about out in the fields, but here in the Victorian era, they really know how to live large. They have moved into a mansion and there are like little families all around, hidden obviously, living out of sight of the big people, and they borrow from the big people in order to make their living, and they're all named after the place where they live. So our main characters are the clocks because their entrance in and out is under the clock. And when Arietti first sees the clock in person, like, it's just such a beautiful, wonderful description. I think there's a morning room group as well. There is, though, a sense of sadness and melancholy to the borrowers that is never really resolved. It carries on throughout, and you can kind of tell that from the very first page. This is how the book begins. Mrs. May lived in 2 rooms in Kate's parents' house in London. She was, I think, some kind of relation. Her bedroom was on the 1st floor, and her sitting room was a room which, as part of the house, was called the breakfast room. Now, breakfast rooms are all right in the morning when the sun streams in on the toast and marmalade, but by afternoon they seem to vanish a little and to fill with a strange silvery light, their own twilight. There is a kind of sadness in them, but as a child it was a sadness Kate liked. She would creep in to Mrs. May just before tea time, and Mrs. May would teach her to crochet. And also, Mrs. May tells her the story of the borrowers. When I found this in a book of my old childhood, a box of my old childhood books, I couldn't remember if I'd ever read it, and I think I did not read it growing up, which I think was probably good, because I would have been upset by some of the distressing things. So I'll give a spoiler warning, but yeah, as a kid, I would have been upset about Eglatina, who I think we're supposed to think she just dies along with her mother/stepmother, because it is a fated community of borrowers. All those little families, the Clocks are the only family left, and it's not exactly known what happened to all of the rest of them. The owner of the mansion has been bedridden for many years, so there are no longer these lavish parties, and like there's no longer a lot of life in the house that can sustain these little families of borrowers. And I think that the fading of the borrowers kind of mirrors that fading of the Victorian era, which is something I can appreciate as an adult, but as a kid I would have just been upset about Eglatina. So, although, you know what, maybe Eglatina is still alive. There was a memorable line in here about how stories never really end. We just stop telling them. So who knows what happened to Eglatina and her mom. They might have been totally fine. I have also read The 100 Dresses by Eleanor Estes. I picked this up because I love the book The Witch Family, also by Eleanor Estes. That is so charming. And it's more of a traditional book. Like, it has more of a plot. This is more of a kind of moralistic book. It was sweet in its own way. I think I prefer The Witch Family. But this deals with bullying. And it's actually told from the perspective of kind of one of the onlookers / co-bulliers. And I read in, I think, the introduction that actually this is a true story, and that Eleanor Estes herself, you know, lived through this when she was young, and she felt so bad for the little girl that she kind of bullied. And you can see in the story, I guess this is a spoiler, so there's another spoiler warning for you, but the little girl that they bully ends up moving away. She and her family are immigrants, and they can't fit into this small town, and so her father says, well, we're just gonna move to the big city where there are lots of immigrants, lots of people with funny accents, and we'll fit in better. And Maddie, the main character, who I think is probably based on the author, she feels so bad about how they've bullied her, and it's a very subtle kind of bullying. And Maddie is constantly like imagining ways she could stand up for her, defend her, but she never really has the chance. So I feel like this book was kind of the author's way of retroactively trying to make amends. So I am glad I read it. It's always really neat to check out other books by authors that you love. I've just started Little House on the Prairie, my reread of this. One great thing about children's books is how evocative they are and how they take you to these other worlds. You shrink down and become a borrower, you know, making teapots out of acorns and things, or you're out west on the frontier. There are so many little details that really capture the scene. Like at one point, Pa is coming back from hunting to their campsite, and she writes about how it was, you know, twilight, sunset, and Pa's long shadow met her before she met him, and it just, you feel like you're there with her. And then I have also been reading Oscar Wilde's fairy tales, which I feel like this is packaged in different ways. The Happy Prince and Other Stories is the one I'm reading. I just got the free version on Kindle. These are very much fairy tales in the old tradition of otherworldly, unusual fairy tales with some tragedy, with some symbolism, and yet you also have Oscar Wilde's tongue-in-cheek sarcasm, and the way they meld and sit side by side is so interesting. This is our book club pick for this month. We're going to be discussing it on Saturday, March 18th, and it was a very, very quick read. I think I only have one story left. So it'll be fun to chat about that. And then of course, we're going to be chatting about The Cloud of Unknowing in April, right after Easter. April 15th is going to be our date for that. And this read along, I have a couple other co-hosts. Christy has been posting so many great quotations. I feel like a lot of them are the same lines I'm underlining. And Faith from Faith in Books, she's also one of our co-hosts, and she participated in Feb Regency, and she posted the most amazing vlog. They had such a fabulous party. She got her whole family on board. They had costumes and music and card games and an amazing spread of food. It was just really fun to see her video pop up. That was pretty fantastic. I'll make sure I link it down below. But I've been making some progress in the cloud of unknowing, and it has been so wonderful. In my announcement video for the read-along, I shared the author's introduction, and he had quite a kind of warning at the beginning of his book. And one of the things he says is that you shouldn't read it out of order because there might be some things earlier on that, you know, inform what comes next. And I can kind of see that because he talks about the active life and the contemplative life. And his focus is going to be on the contemplative, but he also acknowledges that in this life you can't just sweep away the active life. They're both important. The active life is such that it begins and ends on earth. The contemplative life, however, may indeed begin on earth, but it will continue without end into eternity. This is because the contemplative life is Mary's part, which shall never be taken away. The active life is troubled and busy about many things, but the contemplative life sits in peace with the one thing necessary. That's, of course, referring to that Mary and Martha story from the Bible. And whenever I've thought of that story, it's like either you're a Mary or you're a Martha. You identify with one character or the other. So I loved this thought instead, that actually there's a Mary and a Martha inside each of us. And he acknowledges that, you know, the active life with good deeds and works of mercy and prayers and reading and study, all of that is important, but he's writing about something a little bit different. He also acknowledges how, you know, as mortal human beings, we're never going to fully know and see and understand God, who is divine. You know, in this life we see darkly. Later on we'll see face to face. But in spite of that, he is talking about how you can still contemplate God and try to contemplate that which is unknowable. In fact, that's why you need this cloud of unknowing. And he's talking about how, you know, you need to quiet yourself, quiet every extraneous thought, and just try to pierce the cloud of unknowing with your love of God. As it is wrong for a person who sits in meditation to be thinking about the things he has done or will do, regardless of how good and worthwhile they may be in themselves. Likewise, it is wrong for a person who ought to be busy with the contemplative work in the darkness of the cloud of unknowing to let ideas about God, his wonderful gifts, his kindness, or his works distract him from attentiveness to God himself. So even though they may be good thoughts and holy thoughts, when you are trying to engage in this contemplative work, you are really just trying to absolutely quiet your heart, quiet your soul, and just be focused on that cloud of unknowing, just be focused on God himself, which I think is so difficult and yet so important because, you know, on social media you scroll through the feeds, and I think sometimes our brains, it's like they never stop scrolling, even when you're sitting at rest. Like your brain is trying to think, did I forget to do that? It's difficult actually to really completely quiet your mind. So I think this is a really helpful reminder to try to put that into practice myself and just spend some time where you really quiet your mind and just sit in the darkness, sit in the cloud of unknowing. The author talks about how time spent that way is actually refreshing, and that, you know, will give you grace that you need moving forward back into the active life. So really enjoying this. One last book, which I felt was very appropriate to mention this Lent, although I have plenty of other spiritual books that I bought at the National Shrine a while ago. I posted a haul of that, and I want to get through those too. But I just read Paradise Lost by Milton for the first time last year, and I really liked it. In fact, it would be perfect for Lent because it literally takes place during the 40 days Christ is in the desert, which is, of course, what Lent is. This is a book about Paradise Lost, and it is by Elizabeth Marie Pope, and she is one of my favorite authors, but she only really wrote 2 books, and actually they would be perfect for middle grade March because they are children's middle grade literature. One is The Perilous Guard, which is set at the time of Queen Elizabeth, and talk about the little people. That deals with fairy magic in such a beautiful way. And the other book is The Sherwood Ring, which has some time travel. I was gonna say it's set in colonial times, but like since it has time travel, it's kind of set on multiple eras. And actually, The Sherwood Ring, so I've mentioned this previously, my friend Kate Howe and I are going to do an in-person meetup this spring. It'll be a sort of bookish picnic, and we are going to discuss a book. That book is The Sherwood Ring by Elizabeth Marie Pope. It's going to be kind of April, May, and if you're in the northeastern United States, so like Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York, that area, if you'd like to come, just send me an email emma@bookishprincess.com, and I'll send you more details. I already have a list of some of you who have already emailed me, so really looking forward to that. But this is the only other book by Elizabeth Marie Pope that I could find, at least, out there. So when I saw a copy of it that wasn't too expensive, I thought I had to grab it, and it would be fun to try to read during Lent. I believe Elizabeth Marie Pope was actually a professor at a university. I'm not sure which university. I wish she had written more though, because those 2 children's books she wrote are just absolutely delightful. Anyway, I'm gonna wrap it up here, but I hope you guys are having a great March reading month so far. Thank you all so much for your lovely comments on my 10 years on YouTube video. I felt like that had been percolating in the back of my mind for a long time. And so it was nice just to sit down and chat about some reflections on my time on YouTube. I do feel so lucky to have such a kind and lovely group of subscribers. So yes, thank you all so much for your wonderful words on that video.